One of the first videos we made on this channel was a list of some great books to get started with game development as well, that I've personally read and that I wanted to share with the world. Now, that video is more than a year old at this point, and I have kept on reading more and more into game design books and game development related books. So in this video, I figured I would just sit down and talk a bit more about some of the great books that I've read over the past year, and I want to share with you why I think they're great and why you should also go and consider reading them. So stick around. I think there are multiple great ways to learn about things. Maybe if you're really just wanting to learn how to program Unity mechanics, books are not the ideal solution. Something like a YouTube tutorial will be more up to date and will also be better at visually showing you what to do and how the outcome will look compared to a book where you can only have still images. I do think that books are one of the other very good resources, however, for anything that's not exactly programming and like 100% code-wise related. So more if you look at things like narrative design or simply how do I make my mechanics, how do I make fun, basically. I think books allow us to really dive in very deeply into what exactly goes on behind the scenes into making an enjoyable game. So with that in mind, I've compiled 5 books for today's video that I've personally read over the past few years and that I believe are really good at improving at certain parts of game development. And the first book I want to talk about is Level Up, The Guide to Great Video Game Design by Scott Rogers. It's one of my recent books that I've read as well. And I was contemplating between 2 books to put on this list. I wanted one, big game design book, and it was either this one or it was The Art of Game Design, A Book of Lenses. That one is generally considered the gold standard, but I wasn't 100% a fan of that one. It was a bit too long to my liking. It's about 650 pages, whereas this one is a mere 550, much more doable for mortal souls like me. And I think that they convey the same messages in the end, and I think this one is actually even a bit more up to date than the last revision even of The Art of Game Design. Now, as I said, this is basically the textbook to learning how to make games in a non-programming aspect. If you told me you had only a single book you could read about game development and then you had to make a game, this would be it. Simply because it covers everything. It will take you through start to finish, how do I make a game? So I start with how do I get my idea, even covers things like game design documents, how do I write down my vision? And then it goes in deeper into stuff like level design. It goes into explaining the different kinds of combat systems you can have in your game, for example, different ways to structure NPCs, how to make everything tie together. Even things like cutscenes are covered in this book, talking about when you should and shouldn't use them. Spoiler alert, you should almost never use them. And just in general, also things like monetization and everything. As I said, this book covers basically everything except programming. You'll see that throughout the trend of this entire video. Basically, programming, I do believe, is something that you need to learn either hands-on or by using YouTube tutorials. But just for making games, I think this is probably one of the best books you can get started with in just making a game, getting your ideas, and becoming a game designer in general. The next book I have is Video Game Storytelling by Evan Skolnick. This was actually the first game design book and game dev related book that I read back in the old days when we had the genius idea at Bite Me Games to make an open world RPG that was narrative driven. And I was like, I'm gonna read this book. I've never written in my life before, but after reading this book, I'll be able to write amazing stories. That did not happen. It wasn't just a technical limitation why we didn't make that awesome RPG. It was also simply because the narrative wasn't there yet. Now, that wasn't a problem of the book, that was a problem of me just not being a writer before. I think that this book was really good. It gave me an amazing primer on how does narrative design work and how does making a story work, not just for video games, but also just for books in general, for example, how you should divide your story up into multiple acts, talks about the hero's journey and stuff like that, and also how to exposition your world. And in general, I think this gives you a very good idea of how should I make my game a bit more narrative. Now, as an indie developer, I wouldn't suggest that your first game is very heavily focused on a narrative, but it's still a really good idea to have a basic idea, which is what this book gives you. It's also not that long of a book, so you can go through it quite easily. I think it's like 200 pages at most, and you'll learn a lot of it in that period of time. There's 2 parts to the main book. So the first part is, as I said, different kinds of story arcs, how they work, how you exposize, how you write characters, things like that. But the second part of the book actually goes into the roles of game development and how these roles actually influence how your story feels. So yeah, you have your narrative designer who makes the actual story of, for example, you're the Witcher who has to go and rescue Ciri in a game. But it's not just them who make the game. It's the level designers who really can create that mood of, oh, it's a very dark graveyard. It's a combination of the audio engineers who give it a more menacing and dangerous ambient soundtrack. And it's even the programmers who are responsible for coding the AI, for example. How do your enemies behave? How do your NPCs behave? That's something that all ties back into the story and is something that is often overlooked as, oh, this mustn't be part of the narrative journey of this game. So in general, reading this book will not make you a great writer, but it will give you the tools to start becoming a great writer. If you actually want to become a great writer, there's this quote that I want to carry over from writing books, is that your first 1,000,000 words are horrible, and only once you've written 1,000,000 words, your stories will actually become something. I think that same goes for writing video games, although there's no real word count I can give you there. The next book I have isn't really talking about a single concept or making games, for example, but was still really inspiring, and that's Sid Meier's memoir, A Life in Video Games, by the one and only Sid Meier. You probably, if you have been playing games at any point really, have heard of Sid Meier. He's the guy who made Civilization, who made Railroad Tycoon, and a bunch of other games that in his memoir he talks about how he has gone from a regular software developer back into the old days to where he is now as one of the pioneers of game design with the Civilization series and stuff like that. Whilst the book, you can tell that it's a bit, what he did back in the 80s doesn't really translate anymore to how we make games now, 40 years later, but it's still a very interesting look into how did they make games and what are the design considerations, and it also teaches you a bit about how did indie games supposedly publish back in the old days when they had to physically call up stores to go and sell their games if they didn't have a publisher. It's also just really inspiring to hear about these success stories and the fun stuff they did, like for example buying a plane for promotional reasons and then flying journalists around with it. In general, I think this is a very entertaining read, and if you have the time, and especially if you've ever played a Sid Meier game before, it's really fun to just read about how he made his legacy basically. As I said, programming is something you have to learn through video tutorials in my opinion, but I still want to add a more technical book here, which is why I decided to go for Game Programming Patterns by Robert Nystrom. I hope I say it right. Because I feel like at Bite Me Games here, when we make these YouTube videos for you, I don't know what engine you're using, so we try to make our videos engine agnostic. It doesn't matter if you're an Unreal, a Godot, a Unity, or an own engine developer. We still want to teach you some stuff. And whilst something like learning to code C# wouldn't be applicable to everyone, I think that learning programming patterns and specifically how they tie into your game is actually very valuable. These patterns are universal throughout basically any language and can even translate to use cases that are outside of game development and just general software development. So why do you need them? Well, you make your code a lot more efficient by using these programming patterns. For example, if you have a game where you need to spawn a lot of mobs, for example, a lot of monsters, NPCs or whatever, there are certain patterns to really make it as efficient as possible to just clone them instead of having new game objects each time, for example, which improves performance. Or another very classic one is if you need to render an entire forest, how do you just render only the part that your player is currently looking at, but then the moment that he is looking at a different part of the forest, just like that, you can generate that original part of the forest again and render it out. If this is something that you're interested in, be sure to leave us a like and comment, by the way, because we're probably planning on making a bit more of an in-depth video into game programming patterns as well. I wouldn't be hosting that because I'm not that good at coding, but I'll figure out some of the other coding guys here at Bite Me and they'll give you a very good explanation of some of the patterns. Our last one kind of hit me out of nowhere. I'm always actively looking for new books to learn about game development and also just sometimes books to read for entertainment. And every year Goodreads, which basically is the platform where I track all the books that I read, announced their best books of the year. And on number 1 was the book called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Sievin. I didn't know what it was about, I had never heard about it, but when I started looking at the description, just purely out of interest of, oh, what are people reading this year? It was a book about game development and I was shook. I had no idea that a book like this would become a number 1, literally. And it's a fiction book, so it's not really something like, oh, I'll learn how to make a specific feature, but it's a fiction book about game developers. And What interested me was that the comments of how are the ratings for this book, all the negative comments were that this book was too much focused on game development by the normie readers. Which is perfect for me, because I want to learn more about game development. And I think what we get is a beautiful mix of fiction. It's a fictional story because they're successful on their first game, so hey. But it's also, they talk about actual game development concepts. They talk about how has your game become fun. And it's not always realistic in how quickly they develop maybe something, but it is still very realistic to show things like crunch, to show things like publisher interactions and things like that, which surprised me a lot that these things are real and they were really well depicted in this book, whilst also having a completely different storyline dealing about things like loss and grief and just being an interesting read in general and really entertaining. I think if you want to maybe have something that's completely out of what you normally read, this is a really good try, and it's also a really good book just in general in a literary sense as well, the feelings and the emotions that it brings up. So in general, I think you should really consider reading books, even if it's something that you're not really used to doing, because honestly, a lot of people nowadays, why would I read a book when I could just scroll on TikTok and get funny dopamine hits all the time? But I think books really give us extra depth into learning about topics and truly mastering and understanding it. So take any of these books, really, you can't really miss by reading any of them. I personally give you my guarantee that you'll enjoy them and learn something new from them. And I can also guarantee you that you will learn something new from all of the videos we make on this channel. So if you're new here, we're a group of game developers making our own game Forge Industry, a resource management and automation game. You can wishlist us already, and we will be releasing a demo for Steam Next Fest, which is linked down below. And we also make content like this, where we talk about game dev related topics. We talk about things you can improve about your game, mistakes to avoid. We showcase our own experience making our own games, and generally, yeah, game dev stuff. So if that is something that you're interested in, maybe you're an aspiring indie developer, be sure to subscribe, as it's a win-win for both of us. We get your likes and you get our cool videos. That's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.